The fire took Mountain Flower Valley on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that later seemed important to people who needed things to feel organized when everything else had come apart. Marco Vega logged the sound of the trees before he logged anything else, because Marco Vega logged everything. 16 years as a Navy SEAL had built into his nervous system a cataloging function that operated before conscious thought. And so on the Tuesday night when the secondary fire front swept down from the southwest ridge and the pines began to detonate in the heat like compressed ammunition, Marco noted the sound and then noticed that he had noted it and felt something close to contempt for his own reflex, because there were other things that required his attention. The evacuation route, the burning to the southeast, the Irish wolfhound that was not in the truck. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from tonight, and subscribe to this channel before we go further, because what Marco Vega left behind in that fire and what he found in its ash 6 days later was not simply the story of a man and his dog. It was the completion of something that had begun long before the fire, in a life that had contained too many departures and not enough arrivals, and the dog was the thing that finally made the difference between those two clear enough to act on. Marco Vega was 38 years old and had come to the Colorado mountains late, which was the accurate way to say it rather than saying he had escaped to them, because escape implied running from something, and Marco had always been running toward things, which was both his defining quality and the thing that had cost him the most. He had grown up in San Antonio, the son of a man who worked construction and a woman who worked a school cafeteria, both of them from Mexico, both of them practitioners of the specific, undemonstrative industriousness of people who have been given a second chance in a country and intend to honor it completely. He had an older brother named Ramon who had joined the Navy before him, who was strong and brave, and whom Marco had watched the way younger brothers watch older brothers, which was simultaneously with admiration and with the pressure of needing to match what he saw. Ramon had been injured in a training accident and had come home changed, not entirely and not permanently, but changed enough that Marco had understood the scale of what the work asked, and had made a choice that certain young men make at that juncture, which was to decide that if the work asked that much, then it was worth doing. He had joined the Navy, become a SEAL, served 4 tours in the Middle East, and in locations whose names he was not permitted to use in any document, and had been good at it in the particular way that men from difficult circumstances are sometimes exceptionally good at difficult work, not because they lack imagination about what can go wrong, but because they have already been living alongside what can go wrong and have developed a functional relationship with it. He had married a woman named Lucia during the second tour, and Lucia had been extraordinary, and he had been absent in the specific, total way that operators are absent, not merely physically but mentally and emotionally, and in every sense that a marriage requires presence to sustain. Lucia had been patient because Lucia was constitutionally patient, but patience is not infinite, and the marriage ended after 8 years without cruelty or drama, simply with the accurate understanding that Marco had chosen something else for so long that the choice had become structural. He knew she was right. He held no grievance. Carrying that clarity while also carrying the loss was something else entirely. He had gone to the Colorado mountains because a friend from his team had told him, once, on a night in a country neither of them was allowed to name, that the current Fork Valley in October was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen that wasn't classified. Marco had come to see it after retiring and had stayed in the way that certain men stay in places that do not ask too much of them, which is to say that the mountains asked him to be competent and present and respectful of their terms, and did not ask him to explain himself. And this was a significant relief after a career in which every environment had required him to perform a specific version of himself at maximum capacity. He worked security consulting remotely, which required his brain, but not his body, and the imbalance of this left his body with an excessive capacity that he discharged in morning runs on the mountain trails and in the general physical labor of maintaining the property. He had not intended to stay permanently. He had not intended many of the things that had become permanent in his life, and had come to regard intention as a somewhat overrated planning tool. Vera Horton had been his neighbor since his first week in Mountain Flower Valley, a large-framed, white-haired woman of 73 who had been in these mountains for 20 years and who had appeared at his door on his 5th day with an apple pie, and the direct expression of a woman who had long since stopped performing social nicety in favor of the actual content of social interaction. She had Irish wolfhounds, 4 of them, housed in a barn that was as well maintained as anything Marco had seen in his operational life, and she had told him to come see them in a tone that indicated this was less an invitation and more a scheduling notification. He had gone. The 4 dogs were enormous and ancient-looking, gray and shaggy, and possessed of amber eyes that carried the quality of something from a much older world than the one currently available. Bridget was the oldest, 7 years, with shoulders at the height of Marco's waist when she stood, and a head that, when raised, found his at the level of people he had to look slightly down to address. Vera said simply that Bridget had been waiting for him, by which she meant that Bridget had identified Marco as her person from the moment he walked into the barn, and that this happened sometimes with this breed, and that it was non-negotiable. Marco had returned to his property that evening and Bridget had been at his door when he arrived, because Vera had brought her, and that was the end of the deliberation. 3 weeks later, Bridget was sleeping on the floor beside his bed. A month after that, Marco would have noticed her absence from any room within seconds of entering it. The thing that a large, intelligent, ancient-bred dog does to the mathematics of loneliness is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, but the closest approximation is this. Loneliness operates by making space feel larger than it should, so that rooms echo and mornings extend, and the hours between structure and sleep become a kind of terrain that has to be crossed rather than simply inhabited. Bridget contracted the space. She did this not through demand or performance, but through the specific, unwavering quality of her attention, which was total and unconditional, and aimed at Marco with the focused patience of a creature that had decided its assignment was him, and found the assignment entirely sufficient. She walked at his exact pace on the mountain trails, not adjusting to him, but simply moving as if his pace were also hers, which over weeks began to feel less like accommodation and more like a fundamental agreement. She slept at the foot of the bed and was upright within seconds of Marco moving in the night, not anxious, simply responsive, the way a system checks its parameters at any change in input. She had been bred over centuries for precisely this combination of guardian function and companionable presence, and whatever it was she had identified in Marco on the morning he walked into Vera's barn, she had determined it was worth the full application of everything she was. The cancer came for Vera at the end of that winter, which arrived with the specific cruelty of things that come for people who have been doing something important and are not ready to stop. Vera delivered the news with the same directness she applied to everything, standing in Marco's kitchen with her coat still on, and Marco listened and understood and asked what she needed. She needed to go to Denver for treatment, months of it, possibly longer. The other 3 wolfhounds had been arranged with a family she trusted. Bridget was already Marco's and had been for months, and both of them knew it. Vera put on her coat and said at the door that she had told him Bridget would take care of him, and she hoped he had been paying attention to the degree to which that had been literally true. Marco said he had. Vera said good and walked to her truck, and that was the last conversation they had before she left for Denver. And Marco stood in the doorway watching the truck go, and Bridget stood beside him, and neither of them moved until the truck was out of sight. The fire came from the southwest on a Tuesday in late September, which was earlier in the season than anyone had prepared for, driven by 3 years of drought that had turned the mountain underbrush into something that burned with the urgency of materials designed specifically for that purpose. Marco received the evacuation alert at 11 in the evening, and the smoke smell had already preceded it by an hour. And Bridget had been different since 4 in the afternoon in ways he had noticed but not acted on, more alert, stationed by the door in a posture that was not her usual posture, something in her reading of the air that he had registered without translating. He packed for Bridget in the specific order of priority that emergency situations required: food, water bowl, blanket, veterinary documents. Bridget loaded herself into the truck, as she always did, and settled in the back seat with her enormous head near the window, and Marco drove. The fire line to the southeast was visible as orange through the trees, and the road was running fast with other evacuees, and Marco was making the calculations that 16 years of training had made automatic, route, speed, contingency. A secondary front he had not known about cut the primary evacuation road. Marco turned the truck left, and the left turn was wrong, but the primary road was closed, and he turned left, and the road shoulder had gone soft from 3 days of wind erosion, and the truck went into the ditch at a speed that was low enough not to injure him, but high enough to open the rear door on impact. And when Marco came back to full clarity, the rear door was open and Bridget was not in the truck. He called for her. He went around the truck and called again. The fire line to the southeast had moved in the time he had been in the ditch. The orange was larger, closer, and another vehicle had stopped on the road, and a man was shouting from it that they had to move now. And Marco called Bridget's name one more time into the dark forest, and the dark forest gave nothing back. And he got into the other vehicle because there was no alternative that did not end with him also in the fire, and the vehicle moved, and Bridget was behind him in the dark and the smoke, And that was the fact he carried for the next 4 days. The fire was 62% contained by day 4. 3 structures lost, no human casualties, the latter figure prominent in all reporting. Marco spent the 4 days in the Gunnison house of a distant contact of Vera's, which was the only available option, and he filed missing animal reports and watched the containment percentage update and did not sleep in any meaningful sense, because sleep required the brain to release its grip on things, and his brain had not been designed to release its grip, and the design was holding. On day 4, the figure was 71%. On day 5, access to the affected area was partially restored. Marco was in his truck at 4 in the morning when the roads opened. He reached the burn line at dawn. The boundary between the living forest and the fire's work was one of the sharpest visual experiences he had encountered in a life that had contained a number of sharp visual experiences. Green on one side, absolute black on the other. The line between them drawn by wind and topography in the specific way that fire draws lines, which is not straight but decisive. Marco parked on the green side and got out, and the smell of the burn came immediately. That specific smell that fire leaves in places where it has been complete, which is not the smell of anything burning, but the smell of the absence of the thing that was there. He walked to the burn line and stood at it, and then walked into it, because the house was approximately 150 meters into the burn, and he did not know if the house was standing, and he did not know if Bridget was anywhere within range of being found, and both of these facts needed to be resolved. He saw her at 50 meters. The Irish wolfhound's size worked in his favor in the flat gray of the burn scar, which contained nothing else of her height or her color, and he stopped walking when he saw her because his legs stopped before his decision was made. She was standing. Her coat tips were darkened, but she was standing in the ash between the remnants of 2 black pine trunks, and she was looking at him from 50 meters with those amber eyes that had been watching him every morning for months, and she was not moving. Marco stood where he had stopped for a long moment because whatever was happening in his chest required him to not move while it happened. Then Bridget walked toward him, not running, not hesitating, the steady, deliberate walk of a creature covering the distance between where she is and where she is supposed to be. She walked across the ash and she walked to him, and she put her enormous shaggy head against his chest, and he put both arms around her and his face into her burn-tipped coat. And he stayed there, standing in the burn scar, holding the thing that had stayed where he had been unable to stay, for a period of time that he did not measure and would not remember clearly. And the ash was gray around his boots, and the sky above the burn was pale gold, and nothing in the landscape was asking him to explain himself, which was what he needed. Vera came back from Denver 11 months later. The treatment had worked, which the doctors attributed to early detection and which Vera attributed to stubbornness, and the distinction may not have been significant. Marco was at the cabin when she arrived, Bridget beside him, and Vera looked at the dog and then at Marco and said that she had told him Bridget would take care of him, and it appeared he had also been taking care of Bridget, and Marco said it had gone both ways, and Vera said that was usually how it worked when people paid attention. That winter Marco called Ramon, his brother, on a night in December for no specific reason, just to call, and Ramon answered, and they talked for an hour and a half about things that were not the things they usually talked about, which was a different kind of conversation and a better one. He called Lucia on a different night, also without a specific reason, just because the call had been unfinished for years, and he had come to understand that unfinished things do not resolve themselves. They simply wait with the patience of things that have nowhere else to be. Lucia talked to him, and he talked to Lucia, and when the call ended, he sat in the cabin with Bridget at his feet, and understood something about where he was that he had not understood before he drove into the burn scar at dawn on the 5th day. He was somewhere specific. He had arrived somewhere. The fire had burned the surface of everything and left the structure of what was underneath exposed. And what was underneath was that this was the place he had come to, and the dog beside him was who had waited for him to understand that, and the understanding was enough to build the next things from. In April, the first green came back to the edge of the burn scar, low and tentative, the specific kind of new growth that appears in the devastation of a fire, as if the land is testing whether the season has actually decided to return. Marco walked the trail that passed the burn boundary most mornings, Bridget beside him at the same pace they had always kept. And on the mornings when they passed the point where the green met the black, he would stop for a moment and look at the line, which was different now, the black less absolute, the green advancing. He did not say anything about this. He did not need to. Some things the fire takes, and some things survive it, and some things grow back differently than they were before. and which category any given thing falls into is not always apparent until the next spring, when the ash settles and the green comes back, and you can finally see what the season has decided. Marco Viga had been a Navy SEAL for 16 years and had operated in environments designed to destroy everything that was not essential. And what was left after all of that, in a mountain valley in Colorado with a silver-gray Irish wolfhound walking at his side, was essential enough. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who is standing at the boundary of something they are not sure they can walk into. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most and which city you are watching from. And if you can, support a wildfire relief organization or an Irish wolfhound rescue near you. Subscribe to this channel and we will keep finding these stories, the ones that begin in fire and end in the green that comes after.